Following on in our late medieval series, today we will be rethinking the peasantry. The peasantry was by far the largest group in England, making up around 80% of the population. However, it was not a fixed and indistinguishable mass. It was a broad classification that had a great deal of variance in formal ranking and experience on the ground. We know that the majority of the population were peasants, but we rarely consider the great differences amongst the peasantry. A peasant was simply someone who worked the land for subsistence first and did not own this land. There's a great deal of variance in this. It could range from a villein, which was the closest thing to serfdom in England, to cottagers, to husbandmen, and even to yeomen who owned their land, perhaps not outright, but potentially in kind or leasehold. Even more commonly, feudalism is now simplistically treated as a synonym for brutality and oppression. But the story of feudalism, understanding the context of its emergence and the details of its decline, tells us a lot about the nature of the system and of the period as a whole. The fact that feudalism declined practically to the level of extinction in England by the 16th century did not happen by accident, but it did not happen through abolition because of the protestation of the masses either. In many ways, it was because of the inbuilt laxities and opportunity for personal arrangements that coincided with an elite cultural ethic of chivalry and wider economic shifts, thinking to expanding trade, production and commerce that enabled a prolonged process whereby feudal bondage waned. By understanding this, we go far to counter too many of the gross simplifications about the Middle Ages. I've explored some of these aspects before, but this goes even further to challenge this monolithic view of the medieval world as static and a world where its inhabitants lived in a solely repressive society. We begin by actually playing devil's advocate for the prevailing view. The worst parts of feudalism have been highlighted en masse in popular histories, depictions in television and film, and in the colloquialism of contemporary language. There is certainly some grounding to this. It doesn't come out of nowhere, and the lot of the true bottom would have been a hard and grueling existence, just as it is today. In England, villeins sat at the bottom of the great chain of being. They made up around half of the population of peasants, therefore comprising a staggering 40% of the population in total. These numbers speak to the height of feudalism, but let's go back to how it actually emerged. Feudalism was established proper after 1066 with the Norman conquest. This was an elite takeover of England, with an imposition of a partly alien, certainly more ruthless in other aspects, culture and politics. The Normans were remarkably successful in this takeover, to the extent that both the native and invading populations had mixed and adapted by the 12th century. Nonetheless, atrocities like the harrying of the North were at the extreme end of this takeover and transformation of English society. Even in this climate, the conditions and rights of villeins did not match those seen in other parts of Europe amongst the serfs. Some historians even question whether real serfdom ever existed in England. The thinking isn't outlandish. The Normans did abolish slavery in England after all. We will naturally see many negatives in this world. It's so different from our own. Nonetheless, my essential argument is that feudalism was not, on the whole, a crushing machine. It was not a fixed and fully pre-planned system. Instead, it relied on and only existed through relations between human beings on different social levels. It emerged out of a multitude of incentives and human needs. Population collapse during and after the Black Death of the mid-1300s reshaped these dynamics between the different levels of society and resulted in significant economic shifts. Roughly half of the population died, dropping from a peak of 5 million to a low of 2.5 million. The devastation, to some extent, was a testament to the conditions of everyday life, but the fact that it hit all of society does reflect that this was not a merely The state of affairs for the peasantry, it's something that affected the wealthy too. The population collapse reshaped income streams that a lord could expect and depend on, with simply fewer people on the land, resulting in less production and fewer rents. Moreover, the surviving population had much better bargaining power against the higher-ups. They were able to attain more land at much better prices, in turn resulting in greater produce, goods to sell in the rapidly expanding markets of the growing towns and provincial centres across England. Through demographic shifts, these economic incentives alone began to chip away at the size of the peasantry and the size and strength of the feudal system. Many peasants either died off, as the middling sorts, nobles and royals did during these natural disasters, or bought their way into husbandry and yeomanry, conditions where they owned their own land. Even if we view feudalism and lordship at its worst, as these modern denigrators do, the greediest and most malicious master would unlikely turn down these payments in these circumstances. Beyond this, there is another flip side that is seldom heard. Feudalism and the nobility existed in lands that were deeply Christian and that later adopted knightly chivalric values, both of which acted as self and societally imposed checks and limits on a man's baseness. At its core, feudalism describes this hierarchical relationship we've outlined above. This involved the fealty and obedience of the lowest to highest, but this was across the order, not just peasant to lord, but lord to monarch. This is a state of affairs that existed in civilizations far before the Middle Ages, and for many years after it. Crucially, and very differently, this system set out many duties and obligations that a lord had to his bondmen. Lords were only granted their position because of the service and provision of arms that they were bound to provide for their monarch, a set number of days a year and a provision of troops out of their locality. This military strength and glory were important parts of the medieval world, but it was also moderated through chivalric ideals that focused on honesty, truthfulness, and fairness in battle. As an extension of this, as their status came from military strength and dominance, lords were responsible for protection of their land, and in turn those who lived and worked within these boundaries. As elites, lords vied for power regionally and nationally. Resultingly, they competed with each other in a variety of ways. Our most evocative image of this is in combat, but this isn't as common and direct as many would often think. Lords attempted to one-up each other in many more and much less aggressive ways. Ostentatious shows of wealth in clothing, decoration, architecture, hospitality were all part of this. However, acts of charity to the church or to the poor were even more highly valued for their associations with the teachings and acts of Christ. Not only was a peasant provided with protection, but he was also provided with housing. For themselves and for their family, this was an important base to lead life not only as an economic and material lens, but also with religious and social connections and fulfillment. This would naturally have been of a varying standard, but it would have been their own tenement, constructed by the lord, paid for through manorial arrangements. Feudal dues, taxes and payments funding this. The peasant would not own their property. This is really the fundamental part of the peasantry in the feudal system, that they are tied to their social superiors and the land wherein. What they did have was right of use of the land and buildings. Economic and social historian Christopher Dyer has argued that the quality and size of peasant houses has been greatly underestimated. There was a practical underpinning to this. It's not only charitable that the lord would provide housing, it's completely essential. As the peasant relies on the lord relied on the peasant, and their work and the fruits of their labour. Dyer suggests that evidence reflects separation of spaces and multiple buildings within peasant tenements, these having different functions, over time increasing the quality, quantity, specialization of production, which in turn lifts standards of living for many. In conjunction with this, along with the above-mentioned trends, the land holdings of the peasantry grew and expanded across the period, particularly in the 14th and 15th century. This returns us to the above lines of argument, that there were greater prosperity amongst the peasants, brought by demographic changes and economic shifts that allowed them to sell surplus of products and goods at market or purchase their own land or property, thus achieving a greater degree of independence, reflecting the personal arrangements that were made, inbuilt laxities, but also the weight of obligations of lordship. As feudalism waned, most of those who remained as peasants, no longer serfs, if they ever were essentially deserted by feudalism and lordships. Most of these lords could no longer provide economically, materially, or socially, as had done before. In many cases, it was not the peasantry that was abolished, but the way that lordship functioned had shifted dramatically. Later on, at the beginning of the early modern period that transitions out of these late medieval changes, we see these commercialized aspects and urbanization making great impacts on lordship. This is completely reshaping the way that the function and purpose of lordship worked. Looking forward into this period, we begin to see how the power of lords and the rights of peasants completely shift. The process of enclosure of common lands completely reshaped the access to open fields that was essential for grazing and for the gathering of natural resources that previously the peasantry had relied on. No longer were the peasants receiving the noblesse oblige of their forefathers, who may have been villeins or serfs, though these coming with terrible drawbacks too. We see a shift away from older ethics and away from the holistic care for the commonality, which became even more pronounced with the Reformation, the dissolution of the monasteries, and the complete restructure of the church in England. In conclusion, the words of R.W. Southern, writing in his Making of the Middle Ages, goes very far to show feudalism as an innovative system as much as a downright depressive one. He writes, "It was not a special degree of misery which drove these men into serfdom, but a need which was felt on all hands for a more lasting and intimate relationship between the landlord and the tenant for the cultivation of the soil. The relationship secured advantages on both sides. To the lord, hereditary labour; to the serf, a mixture of advantages from simple money payment or an additional holding of land to the benefits provided by religious fraternity." There was strong economic and material rationale behind feudalism. This stemmed from moral ideas as well as social ones that were underpinned by the Christian faith that fundamentally moderated it. Choice and agency did exist under it. It was a specific system in a very set time and place. The story of its emergence and the world it built, the circumstances of its decline, go so far to paint a very different picture of the Middle Ages and its people.